Raum and Torvald are two very similar champions if you actually sit down and think about it. Both of them have the exact same damage per second, dealing 800 damage per second. And both of them also have a really good self-sustain. Torvald can regenerate thousands of shield HP in a second, and Raum can also do this and generate thousands of HP in a second. Both of them are also pure off-tanks with absolutely no way to point tank, and that's because neither of them have deployed barriers, which in many ways is actually disadvantageous. And both of them actually have pretty decent crowd control ultimates that are capable of piercing through shields and dealing a good amount of damage. So why is Torvald S tier and Raum D tier? It's a very confusing dichotomy. Well, today we are going to discuss the reasons why one of these characters is S tier and the other character is D tier, despite having relatively similar kits. And it has a lot to do with specifically how their abilities work, and also certain game mechanics that end up making Torvald just flat out a lot stronger. So first of all, let's talk about their weapons. Raum, Ruckus, and Torvald all do the exact same damage per second with their weapons, which is to say 800 damage per second. And Raum and Ruckus's weapons are actually a little bit more similar, considering that they're both hit scans that can also headshot, and these headshots theoretically give Raum a much higher DPS than Torvald if you're able to nail people consistently. However, Raum's weapon also comes with a few more penalties that I would argue actually make Torvald's the superior weapon, and the first of those is the fact that he has a bit of spread. As you can see, even at this medium range, we're ending up missing a lot of bullets when we're fully spooled up here firing at maximum fire rates, and that leads to Raum having much poorer DPS even if he does land headshots at this range, because simply a lot of your bullets are going to be missing those skinnier targets like Leon. So that is the first major downside of Raum's weapon. The second is, of course, this very lengthy reload, although if you play Raum right, you won't really ever have to reload during an actual fight. And then finally, Raum also has A, a wind-up, which makes his weapon slower than Torvald's, and B, he actually slows himself while walking and shooting his weapon at the same time. You can see our movement speed is very, very slow right now, and that means that the enemies have a much easier time hitting Raum than they do Torvald. So now we compare that to Torvald. Torvald, while shooting, does not self-slow at all, and look at that. Pinpoint accuracy, and he has very good fall-off as well. He actually has very solid range for a tank. And this allows him to do consistent damage even at medium range, which is something that Raum struggles to do. And that lack of self-slow really means that Torvald is a lot snappier. He's able to avoid damage much more easily. He scales with movement speed buffs like Nimble much better. And the fact that he has no spool up means that he can much more reactively deal damage to characters, and that fast reload means he can spend more uptime actually shooting people if he's forced to actually reload, because sometimes you do get forced to reload in the middle of a fight with Raum. It's very awkward. Torvald just doesn't have to consider that at all. A very fast reload, and then you just get back to shooting. And his damage is very powerful. He can one-clip people, as long as they don't get healed or have crazy amounts of damage reduction or anything, so very, very good weapon. There's one final consideration with Raum's weapon, though, that's actually, I would consider a major, major detriment to this character, and that's the fact that Raum only really actually has 4 abilities. His gun, his soul harvest, his juggernaut, and his ultimate. His right-click ability just makes his gun spool up instantly, turning his gun into, well, any other gun in the game that lacks a spool up. So this right-click ability is basically pointless. Yeah, it gives him infinite ammo too, but when you have 500 ammo, I feel like infinite ammo isn't as big of a deal, you know? And while certainly with some cards, his ignition can give him damage reduction, and it can basically allow him to have infinite ammo and never have to reload because it can replenish some of the ammo that he's lost. That's all well and good. It still is not nearly as good of a ability. I struggle to call it an ability, but a quote-unquote ability. It's not as good of an ability as something like Ruckus's right-click, which is his missiles, or Torvald's right-click, which is one of the most powerful freaking abilities in the game. And that, of course, brings us nicely onto their crowd control abilities. Torvald's crowd control ability is his Nullify, and this is one of the best abilities in the game, hands down. The reason for that is that it's a 2-second long silence, which means that the enemies cannot use any of their abilities while the beam is locked onto them. This is also auto-aim, meaning that the enemies can be very, very evasive, but Torvald can still hit the Nullify on them, even if he's not aiming at them at all. And this is huge for Torvald. It enables him to be an excellent counter to basically every flank in the game, as well as any other character who relies on mobility to survive, and even characters who rely on their defensive abilities to survive. With some proper timing and good strategy, Torvald can stop them from using those abilities too. For instance, if Torvald knows that Androxus is about to use his reversal, or Moji is about to use her magic barrier, he can pop Nullify on them, and if he has teammates nearby, they can follow up on the kill while they're nullified, which is insanely powerful. It does only afflict one target, and if you don't get cooldown reset on it, it does have a very lengthy cooldown. But it still has very good uptime because of Torvald's cooldown reset card on Elim, and it's just one of the most powerful crowd control tools in the game. There's no way around that fact. And also with his talent Direct Current, he's got very good range on this thing, which is just a nice little bonus that makes him one of the most powerful tanks for actually securing a kill, as long as he's got follow-up damage from his team. And then of course we also have his ultimate, which is pretty good, although admittedly not even close to the best in the tank class. It does provide him crowd control immunity, which is nice, but it's the worst ult in the tank class in terms of how it applies the crowd control immunity, because it's not from frame 1, right? It has a bit of a delay to it. It only actually gives you the crowd control immunity once the hyper beam is actually doing damage, and, well, there's a big wind-up to the ultimate. Look at that. So, you can't use it to reactively block crowd control, like Saris ult, Ashe ult, etc. It's simply too slow for that. So that is one downside and one point in Raum's favor. But the hyper beam itself is very helpful because it pierces through shields. If you want to kill someone who's low behind their shield, that's helpful. Or you can use it to just blow enemies off the map, or push them away if someone's trying to dive your team, or use their ultimate, or just touch the objective. Whatever they're trying to do, Torvald can disrupt it. Now, if we switch on over to Raum, his crowd control is a bit different. His first crowd control ability is his Juggernaut. Yeah, it's technically a crowd control ability. Look, it knocks people around. You don't necessarily use it for the crowd control unless you're specifically building for it. And the knockback can be decent for displacing the enemies, although certainly not nearly as good as his Nullify. But the one major benefit of Raum, of course, is that he does have this movement ability, which allows him to be very aggressive or also retreat from a situation, far better than what Torvald can do. But it's not without its flaws, because it has a ridiculously long cooldown, actually longer than Torvald's Nullify, and it's very, very easy to counter, because many enemies, including Torvald, have ways to stop movement abilities in their tracks. And if you do that to Raum, then he's kind of stuck out of position with no movement ability. And because his sustain is much weaker than Torvald's, as we'll get into later, it ultimately ends up hurting Raum really badly if he plays against these counters. So it's not exactly a perfect movement ability. And then, of course, his ultimate is actually pretty darn good. Large AoE stun that will also destroy any shields and deployables that it hits. That can be very good for securing kills. It can reactively stop crowd control in its place because it gives him CC immunity from frame 1. So it's a very good ultimate. And I would argue it is maybe a little bit more helpful than Torvald's for general use. But certainly, Raum not having a second good crowd control ability, and also having a movement ability that is very easily countered, means that Torvald ends up having a leg up in the crowd control department as well. And even though he doesn't have a movement ability, he is still perfectly fine without it. But hold on, wait a minute. Torvald actually does have a movement ability. Boom! Massive burst of movement speed. That's right, we have a loadout card called Eldritch Speed, which grants Torvald up to 50% movement speed during recharge and for 3 seconds after it ends. So basically 4 seconds of pure raw 40% movement speed. Is it the best movement ability in the game? No, absolutely not. But there's one very important quirk about this that makes it very, very useful, and that's the fact that recharge is not technically classified as a movement ability. And the movement speed comes from a card. It's not even based on recharge itself. And because of that fact, Torvald cannot be crippled out of his movement speed. So if you're in an EV ult, or you get afflicted by Grover's crippling throw, or whatever cripple hits you, right, with Torvald, you can still pop recharge. You can generate a massive amount of shield health, and you gain that movement speed, and you can reposition very, very quickly. And I would consider that to be a lot more reliable than Raum's movement ability because of all the aforementioned counters to Raum's movement, right? Even Nullify counters Raum's movement, right? So yeah, that really, really benefits Torvald, and if you're not using Eldritch Speed in your build, then what are you doing? It's one of Torvald's best cards. Now let's talk about self-sustain, because that's the thing that both of these tanks are known for, having very high self-sustain, and being, well, pretty much self-sufficient. They need very little help from their support compared to other tanks like Yaggroth or Inara, who require a lot of healing from their supports. And that's because both of them can regenerate massive quantities of health. Raum, with the press of a button, can get 2,000 health, and then some if he has soul fragments on the field. And he has sort of a weird form of lifesteal, where if you're hitting enemies, you generate these soul fragments, and then if you walk near them, it will build up your soul armor, and he can have up to almost 10,000 HP, and he can easily clear 10,000 HP with an item like Veteran. Boom. Almost 11,000 hit points. So that is very, very good self-sustain. But there are some fundamental problems with this that make it very inconsistent, and I think it is a huge part of why Raum is significantly weaker than Torvald right now, and why he's one of the most niche tanks in the game. And of course, the reason for that is Cauterize. Cauterize massively shuts down Raum's ability to self-sustain, mostly in terms of the consistent healing that he gets from shooting enemies with his minigun. And yeah, that's pretty obvious. Raum slows himself when he shoots, making himself a very easy target for weapon damage. Weapon damage applies Cauterize, reducing the amount of healing he gets, especially in late game, by 90%, making that self-sustain almost useless. However, he can still get good value by simply going behind a wall, cleansing anti-healing, and then boom, pressing that soul harvest, and he gets 2,000 healing plus whatever soul fragments he has on the field. And so he can still get that consistent sustain in late game, but it requires good positioning, and also good timing, and it's just a lot harder to get value out of that than by just pressing a button with Torvald and getting 2,000 shield health instantly. But it gets even worse for Raum, because shields actually completely counter his self-sustain. If you shoot a shield with Raum, it doesn't matter how much damage you do to that shield, you will not generate any soul fragments while shooting the shield. So this means that champions like Fernando, Torvald, Makoa, Barrack, etc. all counter Raum really hard. And in a direct matchup, Torvald especially counters Raum really hard, because Torvald's got 2,500 shield health, and then he can recharge again, get another 2,500 shield health. That's 5,000 damage Raum has to do, where he's not getting any self-sustain apart from this. So yeah, that is a major, major detriment to Raum, and honestly, if he could generate soul fragments from a shield, he would be at least a little bit stronger. Although it would also kind of break the lore, because they're meant to be souls. Last I checked, shields don't have souls, so I understand why they did it like that, but it means that, fundamentally, in terms of the gameplay, Raum's self-sustain is significantly hampered by shields. He does have very good damage reduction cards, though, of course. Voidlord is one of the most popular, gain up to 25% damage reduction for 3 seconds after activating Soul Harvest. You could also play for a build that has damage reduction after ignition, and if you pair these two together, you actually get very consistent forms of damage reduction, and damage reduction is very good in this game. But I still don't think that's enough to make Raum have superior self-sustain over Torvald, and still in late game, really lacking that healing is a huge, huge problem. Now let's compare that to Torvald. Torvald's personal shield is really, 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 really freaking good. And the reason for that is because shields are simply very powerful in this game because of the way they interact with many of the core fundamental mechanics of the game. First of all, as we already discussed, it stops Raum from using his soul armor, right? He can't generate soul fragments if he shoots a shield. But also, life rip will not work on a shield, because you can't lifesteal a shield. There's no life to steal. It's a shield. It's not alive. So if enemies choose to buy lifesteal, it just won't work against the majority of Torvald's HP. On top of that, shields do not allow the enemies to generate any form of ultimate charge or credits. So if you shoot Torvald through his personal shield, right, if you're just slamming away at that personal shield, you don't get anything for it. And Torvald actually benefits from that, because as you can see, if our shield gets shot enough here... Okay, put the shield on, Fernando. Do I get it? No? Oh, come on. I believe it's every 6,000 damage that your shield takes. So yeah, there we go. We get a strong defense credit boost, which gives us 20 credits for every 6,000 shield health that we sustain. Torvald is capable of getting some of the highest shield numbers in the game because his personal shield is so strong, and he has his protection bubbles, which generate even more shielding for him. And so that results in Torvald gaining credits for shielding, while the enemies don't get any credits at all, nor ultimate charge, as long as they're shooting either his personal shield or the protection he puts on the enemies. And that really disrupts the economy of credits and ultimate generation in this game and heavily skews it in the favor of Torvald and his team. So that's also really, really powerful about the shield. But then another thing about the shield is that it doesn't get affected by Cauterize. Obviously, Torvald will still get affected by Cauterize. If you shoot him, the shield won't stop Cauterize from being applied to him, but if you want to generate all that health back, Cauterize doesn't mean squat. So even in late game, if you burst Torvald's bubble down, 2500 shield health gone, he can instantly regenerate all of that with a recharge and have another 2500 health ready to go. In effect, that leaves Torvald with, well, also very similar levels of effective hit points to Raum, right? He can get close to, what, 10,000, 11,000 effective hit points. Let's see, we just buy Guardian, we have Veteran. Boom, alright, so I have 7,800 health, I have a 3,600 health shield. If I press Recharge, I generate that 300, 600 health back. So we are looking at effectively, yeah, what is that, 1,100-ish HP? Which is insane. That's a lot of health. But Torvald doesn't get cauterized in late game. Raum does get cauterized in late game. Now, of course, Torvald's not flawless, because Wrecker exists, and it can make enemies deal double damage to shields, almost. And that is, yeah, a huge detriment to Torvald's actual tankiness in a match. And that will, yeah, very much hurt. And by the time late game rolls around, people are going to buy a lot of Wrecker versus Torvald. There's no doubt about that. But that can still end up working in Torvald's favor because, once again, it disrupts the item economy. Torvald causes the enemies to generate less credits, and then he also forces them to spend credits on an item that they otherwise likely wouldn't be purchasing, unless there was also, like, Fernando or something. So, because he's forcing the enemies to buy Wrecker, that comes at the opportunity cost of not being able to buy armor plating, Veteran, Guardian, Unbound, Chronos, etc. Or if you do want to buy those, that's a heavy credit deficit because you're buying two of the most expensive items in the game, and you're generating less credits for shooting a shield. So it really, really disrupts the item balance of the game, and means that, yeah, okay, once they have a Wrecker, Torvald is going to be struggling in terms of his self-sustain. He won't quite be reaching those 11,000 HP numbers that Raum can achieve. But he'll still be reasonably tanky, he'll still have a lot of health to chew through, and he forces the enemies not to be able to buy that item, or forces the enemies not to be able to buy the items they want because they have to buy Wrecker. Meanwhile, Torvald is free to say, oh, let me get some Chronos, let me get some Nimble, I don't have to buy Wrecker, I'm Torvald, heck yeah. And that really, really works out in Torvald's favor. Meanwhile, Raum doesn't really force any items out from the enemy team, and is countered intrinsically by the passive Cauterize, and also by the fact that a lot of characters just have cripples and silences and stuns and CC that they can hit Raum with. So as you can see, even though Raum and Torvald are very similar in terms of their damage output, their ability to have powerful crowd control ultimates, their ability to have very high self-sustain, right? And their lack of a deployed barrier, and also, when cripples are in the picture, their lack of a movement ability, Torvald is just on a totally different level compared to Raum. Torvald is an S tier, and Raum, well, much less so. And that's due to, well, the simple fact that Torvald's self-sustain works differently to Raum's. Torvald's weapon is just straight up better than Raum's in most circumstances, unless you're up in melee range drilling someone with headshots. His mobility, I would argue, is actually better, because he's unimpaired by a self-slow, and he also has a pseudo-movement ability that actually doesn't get affected by cripples, but is very effective at allowing him to reposition or chase targets. And his crowd control is simply just better than Raum's. Raum's ultimate is really good, yes, but Nullify is one of the best abilities in the game, period, and Torvald also has a really good crowd control ultimate to boot. Raum does do some things better than Torvald. He has better damage reduction. I would argue his ultimate is slightly better, but the combination of abilities that Torvald has simply makes him better. And so that begs the question. A, does Torvald need another nerf? I mean, probably. But B, what can be done to help Raum out? And, well, that is kind of a difficult question to answer. Raum already got a pretty massive buff that aims to fix one of his weaknesses this patch, and that is to Enforcer, which now has 1.2 seconds of crowd control immunity while using Juggernauts. So basically, for the wind-up phase of your Juggernaut, you can block crowd control abilities. It still isn't perfect, because his Juggernaut will still be affected by crowd control after the wind-up phase is over, but this does allow him to reactively block crowd control abilities such as Sarah's ult, Ash's ult, BK's ult, etc., with his movement ability, and he actually now has 2 forms of reactively blocking crowd control, compared to Torvald's, well, 0, because even though he's crowd control immune in his ult, he can't reactively use it because of the wind-up phase that it has. So that is very good, and that is something that actually separates him from Torvald, and differentiates him in a way that makes Raum genuinely better than Torvald in this one aspect. And that's really good. I think it's a step in the right direction. But the simple fact remains that right now, Raum is pretty much an ultimate battery for the enemy team. Torvald's bubble actively hinders the enemies from generating ultimate charge and credits. Meanwhile, Raum has the highest health pool in the game, he slows himself, and is the second largest character in the game, making it ridiculously easy for the enemies to actually shoot him, and thus he generates a lot of ultimate charge for the enemy team, because they just constantly shoot him. That builds up credits, that builds up ultimate charge. For every 6,000 damage you do, you get bonus credits. You gain that just by shooting Raum for a little bit. Like, you don't even have to kill Raum to get that credit bonus. So, Raum is really just an ultimate battery for the enemy team. I think if you wanted to help Raum feel a lot better right now, you could honestly keep some of the bad things about Raum. I think the self-slow makes sense, thematically, because he's meant to be a big, heavy brute with a minigun. That's freaking cool. However, I think that it would be very beneficial to perhaps give Raum a new passive, whereby is very simple. You just generate less ultimate charge for shooting him. Kind of like Roadhog in Overwatch 1. Roadhog was in a very similar position, and so they gave him a passive where he generates less ultimate charge for the enemy team. I think that would be very eminently reasonable. It certainly wouldn't break the character, but it would make him less of a liability to have on your team, considering he's just a big hitbox with a lot of health, right? And also, I think, you know, his self-sustain, yeah, it does get hindered by Cauterize greatly in late game, but if you are a smart Raum, if you're skillful, you'll play around cover, you'll hide, you'll cleanse Cauterize, and you'll still be able to get a very impressive amount of hit points, even in late game, and you'll be able to take advantage of that damage reduction that he has from his cards. So I think instead of buffing his self-sustain, like they were going to do in one of the patches previously, where they were just going to make him immune to Cauterize, I think instead of doing that, perhaps a way to maybe make him more lethal, and more of a, I guess, high-risk, high-reward character, would be maybe buff his damage a little bit. I know that's kind of a weird thing to say, but what if he did more damage? Make him actually a really scary demon, because, duh, he's a demon, he should be scary. Because, yeah, if you just even go to this, like, medium range right here, look at that spread. That spread really, really hurts him, and he's still able to tickle enemies, but this doesn't feel like good damage. If he had more damage impact per bullet, this spread would still be an issue, but it would encourage Raum to get up close, and then when you're up close, you get rewarded with what would effectively be Storm of Bullets levels of damage, but, you know, not on Con. And he'd still probably be weaker than Con, too. Maybe that's a way to go about buffing Raum. I don't know. You can, of course, let me know what you think of that idea in the comments section down below. And maybe one last thing to do would be to play more into the idea of crowd control immunity, by perhaps what they could do is put the 1.2 seconds of crowd control immunity that Enforcer has into base kit. So, just the wind-up phase of the run is crowd control immune, period. Regardless of what talent you can go, regardless of what talent you go, you can still reactively block crowd control for the wind-up phase of the dash. And then just extend Enforcer's crowd control duration to, I don't know, the full duration of the run? Maybe that would be overpowered. I don't know. I'm just spitballing ideas here. I want to try and get the ball rolling. But that could also be a way to help Raum out, while still leaving him with some weaknesses. Because at the end of the day, another thing we have to consider is that if Raum gets too strong, he will be the best tank in the game at pub stomping. You know? He would absolutely destroy, like, gold rank and below. And we don't want to create a character that's so ridiculously unhealthy that anyone can pick him up and just absolutely beat, you know, a bunch of novice players, because that would just be really bad for the game's health. It would be harder for players to get into the game. We don't want to have characters like that. And so it's important to leave him with some weaknesses, you know, leaving him weak to Cauterize. If you're bad at positioning with Raum, then make it so that, yeah, he does get, you know, punished with really bad self-sustain. Make it so players have to learn to position properly. And, yeah, make it so that players have to learn to get in close. Again, position themselves properly. Otherwise, yeah, they get this spread. That's before fall-off, too. Raum has fall-off. But even when you don't have fall off, the sprite is still so bad that, like, yeah, you just miss about 50% of your shots. So make it so Raum has to position properly, but make it so that he's rewarded with, you know, a very powerful character when you do position yourself properly. Make it so that when you position yourself properly to cleanse God Rays, you get rewarded with high damage. Position yourself properly in close quarters, you get rewarded with high damage. And, you know, allow him to actually have the tool he needs to position himself properly. That would be how I would try to balance Raum. And yeah, I know I said earlier that it kind of sucks that he really only has 4 abilities instead of 5. But I don't think they're reworking Ignition. I think that would simply be too difficult of a way to rebalance Raum. I don't think Evil Mojo really should invest into reworking this character. Because, yeah, it's just a lot of effort from them, and it probably just wouldn't be worthwhile. But anyways, enough rambling. If you guys have enjoyed, make sure, of course, to drop a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload from me. And I will see you all next time. Peace out.